SoundCartel.
In this episode, we speak to Evo Terra, podcast strategist and producer and host of Podcast Pontifications, about strategy and planning behind creating a successful podcast.
Then when you start thinking about what else can I do with this content? Okay, I've got all that done and now it's posted on my website and it's posted on my podcast hosting company, but now what? Do I need to make audiograms? Should I also maybe break out chunks, a small portion less than 2 minutes, and make it an Alexa flash update and all the other things? It's all great stuff, but it goes back to the plan. Can you do all those things? Absolutely. Should you do all those things? Of course not.
From SoundCartel, I'm Nick Schildberger, and this is Podcasting Essentials. Welcome to episode 14 of season 4. And back with me is producer and co-host Nicole Goodman.
Hi, Nick. And happy International Podcast Day for the 30th of September.
Same to you.
Thank you. It's a great excuse to try listening to a podcast if you haven't already, or dive into a new one. But it's not like we need much of an excuse for that, though.
No, that is true. Any suggestions from your current list for our listeners?
Well, I'm actually listening to a lot of US election podcasts and commentary at the moment.
Of course you are, yes.
And I'm sorry, I bore you with the Daily. Speaking of which, I listen to The Daily. I'm listening to Mea Culpa and The Rachel Maddow Show. These podcasts are taking me away from my beloved true crime, investigation and fiction podcasts, but there's only 4 more weeks to go. So we'll get back on track after the election. But I'm really looking forward to our chat with Evo Terra today because there's a spectrum of strategic planning in podcasting. On the one side, some do none, no planning at all, and they're a lot more comfortable with flying by the seat of their pants. And on the other side, some will plan to within an inch of their lives.
Yes, but before we get to Evo, a couple of podcast app items to mention, both good news for increasing discoverability.
Yes.
First, Apple Podcasts have updated their app as part of the iOS 14 update. And I have not actually seen it myself yet, but I have been told that it is bigger and better. It's more prominent in the new iOS. There's more flexibility with what users can do. There's been an update to the user experience, which makes it a bit more user-friendly. And I guess being more prominent is a good thing because for those people that have never listened to a podcast, hopefully the app's now going to smack them in the face that little bit harder. And for those that do use the app, more functionality is a good thing, and trying to compete with the other apps is good for discoverability.
Yeah, exactly. It's long overdue for Apple, and it's good to see that they've made those changes.
And the second one is that we mentioned last episode Amazon Music now includes podcasts, albeit currently only in the US, the UK, Germany and Japan. So surely we can't be too far away down here in Australia. But either way, there is nothing stopping you submitting your podcast right now to Amazon Music. And you do have to do it via a manual submission, which is at amazon.com/podcasters. But if you do have an audience in those countries, it's definitely a good idea to do it now. And, of course, it will come to Australia eventually. So the sooner you get it there, the better. And it's very much worth it because according to Rob Walsh from Libsyn, in a recent episode of The Feed, he said that Amazon Music's podcasts outperformed a whole bunch of apps on their very first day, and that he couldn't remember any other app having a first day as big as Amazon Music has. So
yeah, it's amazing. Amazon continues to impress. So it's really watch out Spotify, watch out Apple.
Now, let's get to strategic planning of podcasts with Evo Terra.
Look, if you're a podcast enthusiast, you're likely to know the name Evo Terra. In fact, we interviewed him here in 2018. He's a podcast strategist, producer and host of Podcast Pontifications, which is an industry flagship podcast that provides all kinds of helpful information for creators and industry professionals alike. He's a self-described recovering advertising C-suite executive and runs his own podcast agency, Simpler Media, where he is now based in Arizona. And he joins us now to talk all things podcast strategy and planning.
Welcome back to Podcasting Essentials, Evo.
Hey, thanks for having me back on the program, Nick and Nick.
Hey. Now, last time we spoke was a little more than 2 years ago. At that time was when Google Podcasts was just launching, to give you some perspective. You said at that time it was still early days for businesses best utilising podcasting. Since then, the number of podcasts has more than doubled and a lot has changed. But what do you think have been the most significant changes?
Yeah, putting it in perspective of when Google Podcasts launched is definitely taking me back to the way things were going to be. When Google Podcasts was going to revolutionize everything. And then Google Podcast Google did what Google tends to do with most podcasting. And was like, here it is. It wasn't a gigantic change after all. But you're certainly right, Nick, that podcasting has had massive amounts of change. I mean, why are we suddenly seeing double the number of shows? We're at 1.5 or 1.6 million podcasts now. What's changed between now and then? And I think a couple of things have really changed. One has been the entrance of a new player that didn't exist back at that time, a little company called Spotify that has really, really come in and just started swinging large piles of cash around, making everybody say, well, what's this all about? And why should we look at podcasting more seriously? Businesses had already been on an upward tick since around 2014 is when business, the way I track it, started really getting interested in podcasting and moving up. So 4-year growth to 2018. And just like most things that happen when bandwagons begin in the business community, it's a pile-on effect. Businesses discovered not only how relatively easy it is to make a podcast, but also how great it is to do something unique and different that allows them to publish content out to their prospects or audiences, whoever it happens to be, their customers, in ways that they really couldn't communicate with before. I remember when blogging was the big thing for businesses, and that was just boring because nobody wants to read a business's blog, or very few businesses' blogs, because most of them are terrible. They're just writing press releases every day, and nobody wants to read that. But the business podcasters, by and large, I can't say all of them, but the ones that are still going, have found a way to find their unique voice in podcasting, and I think that's really helped businesses more than anything else.
Now, Evo, with this pile-on that's happened in podcasting, how important is planning and developing a podcast strategy to creating a successful branded podcast?
It's key. Out of the 1.5 or 1.6 million podcasts we have, the vast majority are from hobbyists who jumped on a free platform and said, hey, I think I want to talk with my buddies. And that's been the way it's been for 16 years in podcasting, right? No plan, just get on and grab a microphone and see what happens and if anybody cares. And newsflash, they don't. But for businesses who are looking at podcasting seriously, like any aspect of business, planning is important. What are we trying to do? I admire companies who can just jump into podcasting without a plan, but I counsel against that because if you don't have a plan, how do you justify the expense, either the expense in time or the expense of money or other things to do it right? And if you're not worried about those two things, what are you doing to your brand? What sort of damage are you doing when people listen who don't realize this is just a fun side project? Customers don't really care. There's an old quote that's attributed to Abe Lincoln, whether it's true or not, and it says, if you give me 8 hours to chop down a tree, I'm going to spend 7 of them sharpening my axe. Because once it's done, you got the right equipment and the right plan, you just knock things out. And it's the same way. So yeah, as you all know, as I know, there's a lot of upfront planning that goes into making any sort of business podcast, whether it's a full, crazy, narrative branded podcast or even just a simple interview show. You need a plan. If you have a plan and you spend the time upfront, everything else is easier, and more importantly, it can track back to your business outcomes, which is what you should be doing all the time.
So then once we have this overall strategy for the podcast, we then need to plan for the individual episodes. How much planning should we do, and what are your tips on upping your planning game when it comes to episodes?
Episode planning to me is twofold. One, there's the individual episode itself, but I think even more important to that is how that single episode relates to other episodes you've done. You don't have to be doing completely a serialized part 1, part 2, part 3 situation, but there needs to be some sort of an arc that continues throughout, some sort of common thread that happens for the episodes. So step 1, well, I don't know what step 1, but I would certainly think about how each of your episode flows. When I do episode planning with clients, we do it in batch. Like, let's talk about what the next 10 episodes are going to look like. What are the topics we're going to cover on these episodes? And also, here's the important thing, what's the angle? Because a topic alone, so often I see people say, well, I've got a topic and a guest. That's great, but what's your angle? What is the unique thing you are trying to get out? A guest can talk about anything. You can talk about anything. Your business can talk about a lot of things, but not enough of a topic. You need to understand what your unique angle happens to be. Once you understand how your guest can contribute to that angle, that's when you can start planning out exactly what questions you're going to have, if in fact you have a guest. You can also have the ability to figure out what your individual segments of your show looks like. If you do the news up front, then you do the interview process, and then there's a little more fun, whimsical way of doing things. And I think we have a lot of examples of that now, and we really didn't before. Originally, when podcasting got started, we were all just kind of making it up as we went along. But now we've got 16 years of history. We've got serious businesses that are in. We've got serious journalists that are in. We're now seeing and hearing examples of what a well-crafted episode and series of episodes sound like. So the more we can follow plans that get us that way, the better the content we're going to make.
In your podcast, Podcast Pontifications, you talk about the need to rehumanize our podcasts. What did you mean by this?
Yeah, so my podcast is always these weird, deep philosophical dives that nobody's really thinking about and how it works in podcasting. But that particular episode, when I talked about rehumanizing the podcast, was really in response to what's happening around AI and the modifications of, GPT-3, I think is the name of the program. There's actually writing content now where a computer you write a few sentences and it will continue. We have what's happening over with Descript now with their overdub feature where people like me could sit and read into a microphone for 30 minutes and basically train the system to replicate our voice. We just type words out on the page and it can do it for us. Text-to-speech never really worked. It still sounds like a robot. There's this very, very deep uncanny valley with all of these things. But that uncanny valley is getting a lot more narrow. The voices that are coming out and the ability for these computer-generated content to get more and more human-like is continuing to speed up. It almost goes back to my comment about having an angle. Humans have a unique point of view. We have something to say. When we're presenting information on our podcast, we need to put us into it. We can't just regurgitate a Wikipedia article because now we have robots that will do this for us. What is it that we uniquely bring to the table? Even if we're doing short form reading the news, let's put some personality into it. Let's put some emotion. Let's make sure that everybody knows that it's not just a data dump, that there's a real person behind this story. People don't want to just be read to anymore. You can get that. People want to have a real live human connection. And I think as we see more of this machine encroachment into our space, which I love, by the way, I'm certainly not anti that, but I think we need to continue to make sure that we keep it as human as we can, even though we may have less humans doing it in the long run.
We completely agree. It's one of the things we love about podcasting is that it's intimate. We often talk about brands humanizing themselves through the medium of podcasting. So we're totally on board with that one, Evo. I want to move to the topic of video podcasts. On Podcasting Essentials, we've debated the worthiness, I guess, of video podcasts a number of times. Your podcast is both audio and video. So which do you find a more effective medium?
I am an audio-first kind of guy. I cut my teeth in podcasting. I worked in radio, so audio is the way to do things. My show is available on video simply for one reason and one reason only. I turn on when I get on stage. When I'm in front of people talking, as I've done keynote speaking and a lot of public presentations over my years, that's when I'm my best. When it's me staring at a beige wall or a computer screen, I'm just not good. Right now, we're recording this conversation looking at each other on video. Even though it's only ever going to be used in the audio part, we can see each other, which is good, right? So for me, when I record the show, I turn on the webcam, fire up LinkedIn Live. 1 or 2 people watch me record the show live, but even if 0 people watch me record live, that's fine. Having the camera on me makes me be better. It makes me really come alive, and so it makes for a much better show. So that's been my whole attitude about it. And I really resisted putting out a video version of me, my single talking head, talking for 10 minutes because, why would you want to watch that, right? It's not that compelling. Well, I actually now have some data to share about that. So there's something which I call, you've heard of the 80-20 rule, where there's something which I call the 90-10 rule of talking head videos. And that 90-10 rule is this: 90% of your audience will have stopped watching the video before 10% of it has been consumed. And then there's the other little head and ass where most of those will have watched without the sound on, which kind of defeats the purpose. It's not really all that helpful. And I've looked at other people who do something similar with their content. If you're making a video which is just you and your guest talking, recorded on Zoom or some other surface, when you look at the video stats, not the view counts lie, because a view count happens as long as somebody watched for more than 3 seconds. Come on.
Exactly.
That's a terrible metric to use. But when you go look at the engagement rate to see what's really happening, attribution or attrition rate, whatever it is, you will see there's a massive drop-off very, very quickly because people are scrolling through. Video is hugely popular. I'm not down on video. I'm down on video if you can't make compelling video. I'm fine at making compelling audio. I'm not making really compelling video, right? I'm not George Lucas. That's compelling video. Compelling audio is a totally different thing. If you're already using video as an aspect, like me, I'm using it as a crutch to get something out there, then there's no reason not to spend the extra half an hour it takes to throw the video up on YouTube. But beyond that, be careful. Don't think that video is the end all of things, because it is not. You still have to work at making video great.
So then, having said all of that, Evo, if someone comes to you saying they want to start a podcast, would you recommend audio over video, or to do both, or what would your recommendation be?
I would definitely recommend audio first, because in the podcasting world, 99.9% of podcasting is audio. The podcast listeners assume it's all going to be audio. Having said that, however, because today, in the COVID world we live in, more and more podcasts are being done remotely, and we now have the technology. Bandwidth is dropping. It's a lot easier to get video. If you can capture video at the same time, go ahead and do it, but don't plan on publishing that video, because you're going to need to do a lot more work to make that video work. Like, I'm a big fan of doing live video. I think businesses should really grab hold of live, especially like LinkedIn Live and those things for interviews and content. That's great. But just remember that the video that you made live was good live. Nobody wants to watch it in a replay. 0% of the people want to watch a replay. They may want to watch segments, snippets of it as you've compiled it to something else. But now you're paying a video editor $3,000 to put together a 5-minute video. Is that what you want to do either? So lots of questions to be answered.
Yeah, it's like all the planning we've talked about that you put into an audio-only podcast, and the editing and all the things to make the quality really good. The video should be the same.
Yeah.
So if you're going to do a video, you need to do it, particularly if you're a brand, you need to do the video to the same quality that you would do the audio, and that comes with additional costs and other things to consider.
Absolutely.
Now, pivoting away a little bit from video, during the pandemic, more than just podcasters have been forced to broadcast from home, which has affected quality. So how important is the quality to the success of a podcast?
Hugely important. But I would counter that, Nick, with, has it really? I mean, forcing someone to do things at home, has it really decrease the quality? I mean, I think you could argue the point that it has. I mean, I've listened to podcasts that are put out from various organizations that were doing a really, really great job, and the quality suffered big time. It's like when we started watching all of our news programming where the news reporters were at home and the correspondents were at home, the quality dropped suddenly. And to me, I'm puzzled by that. I mean, I'm at home right now. I'm at home on I've got decent sound conditioning. I've got a nice, good microphone. So if you're a podcaster, you can go out and get the right kind of equipment. It's not that expensive, really, to set up an amazing sounding recording system in your home. And if you're a business, and even if you're stuck at home, you've got a budget, work with that, figure out what you need to do, buy an interface, buy a good microphone, get some sound baffling or something to control the environment, and you can really dynamically increase the quality. Because quality is hugely important. If you look at the 1.5 or 1.6 million podcasts that are out there right now, look, Sturgeon's Law applies in all things, which means that 90% of anything is crap. But there's 10% of really, really good stuff. So 10% of 1.5 million is a big number. So if you're producing a podcast that has amazing thoughts and ideas behind them and it sounds like garbage, chances are there's another podcast out there that also has amazing thoughts and ideas in the same genre as yours that sounds amazing. I'm going with the amazing sound every single time.
Now, Evo, what about transcribing podcasts? Is there any real value in the time spent?
So transcribing podcasts is important for one reason and one reason only: accessibility. Mm-hmm. Making accessible content for those with hearing loss By the way, I am someone with hearing loss. Mine is luckily mild, easily correctable, but it has given me a new perspective on making sure that everything we're doing in podcasting is accessible. And transcripts are a part of that. So that's the primary function of having a transcript. If you're a business and you're podcasting, you need transcripts. End of story. Period. If you're a hobbyist and you're podcasting, do you need them? I think you should have them, and it's up to you whether you want to do it or not. There are a lot of services that make transcribing really inexpensive. You can use Descript or some other tool, which is what I use. They say they're 95% accurate. It's laughable, some of the mistakes that they actually get. But you can use other services like Rev or others, and they'll charge you, $1 or $1.25 per minute to have a good enough transcription. Or if you really want it, if you're a business, what I recommend doing is using one of those services and then having someone on your team go back and just clean it up. It's not that hard to do. If you already got somebody on payroll, chances are they can go through and just make it a little cleaner than it actually was. But you should absolutely make transcripts of your podcast available simply for the reason as you would like to be good to the disabled community. You want to be helpful in making sure everybody has every single possibility to enjoy your content, whatever that means. All too often, Nick, people think about transcription for the SEO benefits. And I hate that. I really do. Are there possible benefits from SEO or with SEO if you have a transcription? Arguably, yes, but that's not why you do it. You do it first and foremost for accessibility.
Why? Why would you not do it for SEO?
Well, because if you start doing it for SEO, then you've already got the wrong intent. So now you're like, well, that title wasn't exactly as strong as I should have been, so let me tweak it up that way. And oh, hang on, we need to drop in some graphics or some charts and break things up in a certain way. That's great SEO work for your website. But if you're making a transcription for someone who has hearing loss, total hearing loss perhaps, they need to be able to read through that exactly as it is being said so that they can catch the parts that they actually can't hear. So it does have some SEO benefit, but that's not why you should do it. There are lots of other SEO things you should do. Make sure that first and foremost, your transcription is for the people who need to read it.
Now, moving to content, there are so many ways that podcast content can be repurposed, but it takes more effort than we might think or hope. So what's your advice about slicing and dicing podcast content for the maximum benefit?
Yeah, you're right. It certainly takes a lot of work to really just publish content. A podcast lasts 30 minutes. It should take, 30, 35 minutes to do it? That's it, right? We know that's not the case. My show that comes out 4 days a week that's only 10 minutes long, it's 3.5 hours per episode. 3.5 hours. And that's not prep work and editing deep, because it's just me talking for 10 minutes. That's all the after work. That's all getting the transcript right. The article that gets rewritten completely and published on the site. That's doing good imagery and making sure that it looks good and it's distributed everywhere it's possible, right? It just takes time to do stuff that way. Then when you start thinking about what else can I do with this content? Okay, I've got all that done and now it's posted on my website and it's posted on my podcast hosting company. But now what? Do I need to make audiograms? Should I also maybe break out chunks, a small portion less than 2 minutes, and make it an Alexa flash update and all the other places? All great stuff, but it goes back to the plan. Can you do all those things? Absolutely. Should you do all those things? Of course not. You should only do the things that are going to make sense, that are going to track back to your business goals. There is a lot we can do with the thing we call a podcast and all of the work that went into it ahead of time, and we should totally look at all of that. But don't worry about all the things you could do unless it's part of your plan.
Now, final question, Evo. It's crystal ball time. You play with a lot of new podcast tech, some great, some not so great. What do you think is coming next for podcasting that might be a major disruptor, and how can we plan for it today?
I'm quite interested in something called what I call atomized content. Right now, the podcast production process is pretty straightforward. We record a couple of segments, maybe a long interview, and then we get back in the studio, mash it all together, and put out a podcast episode, which is great. But it has limitations because all of the extra work, all of the stuff that's done that is not finalized, we just can't automatically publish that. But there are some companies that are trying to take a reimagined look at what it really means to make a podcast. And instead of doing it as one episode that starts at 00 and ends 47 minutes later, what if that's actually 10 different bits that are completely independent of one another? Now, the real challenge with doing that previously was, it's only to get to a file, only one file that gets distributed everywhere. Why should we go through all that work? Well, now we're starting to see Spotify, Amazon Music now does podcasting, and they all would prefer something slightly different, either in descriptions or in length or in LUFs or something else. We now have the ability to do user agent detection and push out just the content that's right for that individual platform. So taking that a step further is, what if we could produce all the individual elements, not just to go to different podcast platforms, but what if in the process of making the episode, we really did make something good for an Alexa flash briefing? That would be a fun thing to do, wouldn't it? What if we could actually make it where an animated video came out of the other end for certain segments, not the entire, nobody wants to watch an animated video for 45 minutes, right? Unless it's an animated movie, right? But certain segments might actually work nicely with animated motion graphics and stuff. So there are a few companies that are starting to think about how we do these things differently that will be ultimately assembled into a podcast episode, but also much more bite-sized individual pieces. Attention deficit disorder is greater now than ever before, right? TikTok videos can't be longer than 15 seconds or people start ignoring them completely and all the other pieces. So we're trained to do the small stuff. And we can take big jumps like Quibi, failure, or we could do some smaller pieces, right? And see what the incremental value is going to be. So it's fun. I mean, from a creator's perspective, which is what I think I am more than anything, I'm just fascinated by the new things coming down, which will, I don't know if they'll completely revolutionize what we do, but probably wind up changing how we do a lot inside of podcasting today.
I very much look forward to watching this space along with you, Evo.
Thanks.
Yeah, very exciting.
And thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Evo. It's been wonderful to have you.
It's been a great pleasure. Thanks for inviting me on.
So, Nicole, when it comes to creating a strategy and even preparing individual episodes, the main message I took from Evo, and I definitely agree with it, is to plan, and plan.
Wow, Nick, Evo gave us pearls and you've just wrapped it up in 3 simple words.
Well, actually, it was just one word repeated 3 times. But yes, you're right. There were many pearls in there. And the good news is that was not the end of our conversation with Evo. He will be back on the next episode of Podcasting Essentials to talk to us again.
Yes, he will. Because now we've got a strategy for our podcast, we've planned the episodes, and now we need to understand how to grow our audience. And that is what Evo is going to talk about on the next episode.
I very much look forward to it because growing an audience is so important.
Absolutely.
But that is all we have time for on this episode of Podcasting Essentials. Thanks, Nicole, for joining me as always.
My absolute pleasure, Nick, as always.
And you know what, Nicole? Today, you can do the closer.
Thank you. My dreams have come true. Hope I can do it justice, Nick. You tell me. So to find out more about how we can help you create a podcast, check out our website at soundcartel.com.au or on the socials at soundcartel.au. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're after business insights and inspiration each morning, check out our daily podcast, Business Essentials Daily, wherever you're listening now. From all of us at SoundCartel, thank you so much for listening. How was that? Did I do okay?
A little too well.
SoundCartel.